More and more gamers wonder today what JRPGs have aged well. Everyone always brings up the Chrono games, of course, but besides those two legendary classics, what other JRPGs survived the test of time? I'll show you my 10 picks. The only rule I have though is that the game needs to be at least 20 years old. And with that clarified, let's begin! Number 10. Grandia II. Grandia II came out when the Dreamcast was starting to struggle in the year 2000. I personally consider the Dreamcast as the first console in history with what we call today modern graphics, but this game was 22 years ago, which means it was ahead of its time. Loading times were low, navigation and controls felt great, even with that bulky Dreamcast controller. Animations didn't take much to be executed, so during battle the overall graphics were impressive. I think the area design, be it dungeons, towns or any other place, had a certain contrast with the camera, but it was still manageable for the most part. Some small details might be dated, like proper navigation without a proper map, or the fact that if one of your party members touches an enemy, you enter a battle. But these are small issues that don't make the game any less enjoyable. Unfortunately, Grandia II got a couple of defective ports, especially the one on the PS2. The lag during navigation in battle spells is awful, hindering the enjoyment overall. That specific port did not age well, but the Dreamcast version did so, and to make matters even better, the game was remastered alongside its predecessor on the Nintendo Switch a few years ago. I'd say the remaster is the one to go for, but the original Dreamcast release aged pretty well. Number 9. Luffy A2. Luffy A2 is a game I praise often precisely because of how good it still is to play today. The interface here is supremely smooth, menus open up super fast, encounters take zero time to load, controls run quickly, making battles go faster than most Super Nintendo JRPGs. In fact, I think Luffy A2 has the fastest controls of them all, which reduces the grinding time like crazy. Speaking about combat, I just love how detailed the character sprites and enemies are, especially some of the bosses in big size. It was very impressive for its time and they stand out like a sore thumb. The game's pretty balanced, not hard or easy, just the right difficulty for most types of players. Did I forget to mention that there are no random encounters? That's right, you can see the enemies around. Luffy A2's only setback might be its puzzles with no shortage of nuances in them. But come on, stop pretending walkthroughs or playthroughs don't exist online. Perhaps that's why the game aged so well, because if you get stuck, well, you can persist and try again, of course, but if it gets in your nerves, check up a guide online, which means the only issue in Luffy A2 can be easily fixed. If you feel embarrassed to use guides, then that's on you. It doesn't mean the game's outdated. Anyway, this is a prequel of the series, so it's a great place to start nowadays, as it aged really well. Number 8. Arc the Lad 2. Why 2 and not 1 or 3? Well, 1 is too short, interface is slow, and graphically speaking it just looks way too old. I don't even know what else to say because I really liked it despite all of that. And 3 isn't that great of a game considering it's way too quest focused and often goes boring in both story and gameplay. Still a good game though. And it could be argued that all 3 games aged well. I admit I wouldn't be able to counter much, but I picked 2 because it feels to me that it got rid of the small flaws the first one had, expanded its story and characters, rebalanced the difficulty, and included traditional style RPG elements. In this sequel, everything works just fine and can be easily played, enjoyed, and understood today. It may have a slow start, of course, but it's one of those games that gets better the more it progresses. That's what I call a good story or gameplay progression. Consequently, it has a decent pacing that doesn't take too long to hook the player up. I love how simple yet creative the map designs are with no need to overwhelm them with enemies. Those looking for a more simplistic approach to strategy RPGs, I believe will find this game a great treasure. Sprites and environmental graphics could use some work, but they still look good enough for today's standards. Awesome RPG here. Number 7. Phantasy Star 4. This classic RPG, I feel it gets better with every release on the Sega collections. I remember playing it on the PS2, then years later on the PS3, and finally, years later again, on the PS4. It just looks better there, and the interface feels fresh, fast, and modern. So let's be honest, the game's better played in any of those collections, especially the PS4 one. Nevertheless, we can't ignore the original Sega Genesis release. Graphics and sprites look beautiful. You can't run, but destinations aren't far and walking is pretty fast. I mean, areas and dungeons aren't that long, so if you could run, you will cheese through them in no time. That will still help against its monstrous encounter rate. That little part right there did not age well, and it could hinder the modern player's enjoyment. But since battles load pretty quickly and the interface of those generic looking menus goes by fast, especially if you use auto battle, then you'll be in and out of combat in no time. Since Phantasy Star 4 is kinda grindy, it helps a lot to get into random encounters. Annoying for sure, but at least it's also positive. This game is a masterpiece, and honestly, it is the only one out of the first saga that aged really well. Number 6. Shadow Hearts. Back in 2001, when this gem came out, critics trashed its graphics, but only because they kept comparing them to the ones in Final Fantasy X, which is completely freaking stupid if we consider that Final Fantasy X is a AAA game developed by a rich studio. How in blazes did it occur to them to compare a low-budget title to it in terms of graphics? It's like comparing nowadays a game like Dark Rose Valkyrie to Final Fantasy VII Remake. I think Shadow Hearts aged pretty well, mainly due to the fact that its pre-rendered backgrounds still look nice, unlike most PS1 games where these very same type of backgrounds and environments don't look great nowadays, especially upscaled. Controlling Yuri feels great, a life of quality improvement over the horrible tank controls in its predecessor Kudelka. The game's loading times aren't so bad compared to today's standards, well, ignoring the PS5's loading times of course. It takes 7 seconds to load a random encounter. It'd be better if it could take less of course, but 7 for a 21-year-old game isn't so bad. Besides, the controls during battle are perfect and the flow of it goes pretty quickly. It takes nothing for the characters to perform their animations based on the hit detection of the Judgment Ring, and as weird as the cutscenes look, they are remarkably disturbing and hilarious at the same time. I can't argue over the fact that they probably didn't age well, but I strongly believe that's just a matter of taste. I love them. So yeah, Shadow Hearts aged pretty decently, I say. Number 5. Final Fantasy VI. Despite its shrunk character sprites and its downsized environments, Final Fantasy VI aged gracefully. I know it's been ported and remastered like hell, but in reality it only ever needed resolution upscales to look better in modern TVs. Everything else was already perfect. How this game runs on the SNES is incredible, but it shouldn't be a surprise considering the majority of these consoles' games aged really well. Furthermore, Final Fantasy VI can still be played today, ignoring all of its allegedly improved iterations out there. Sure, back then there were a lot of other games and JRPGs with larger sprites and animations, but this game has that charm that made it so memorable. Like I mentioned, it runs pretty well, which means loading times and all types of animations barely take any time to be performed. Controls are also very responsive in great contrast with the environment. Encounter rate isn't that high in this original version, unlike in some of the game's ports like the PS1 version for instance. Graphics were also fantastic for their time and the pixel art still looks beautiful. Overall, this is a timeless masterpiece that obviously aged remarkably well. Number 4. Super Mario RPG. Squaresoft took a daring risk with this game. It's completely in 2D, but it gives the player the isometric point of view to make it look like 3D, which means developers utilized pre-rendered 3D graphics. Plus, Mario actually controls in all 8 directions when moving around. I know it was released in 1996, the PS1 was already out and the Nintendo 64 was almost there. However, considering the limitations of the Super Nintendo, a game like this ended up running very well. It used enhancement chips to be able to look and play like this. Combat, however, plays in an static board so the characters can perform their animations as best as they can. I think the menus are very easy to understand, being as simple as they are. Controls feel great even when executing the extra attack or the successful defense, and they're very responsive. Those little features will go on to influence other JRPGs like The Legend of Dragoon on the PS1. Nintendo and Square were AAA studios back then, so it's no surprise that their budget was considerable for a Mario game. It turned out pretty well as opposed to other outdated Mario releases that even came afterwards. Super Mario RPG aged incredibly good. It only needs an HD upscale to modern systems since everything else is already of incredible quality. Number 3. Fire Emblem: The Blazing Blade. This game is over 19 years old, not 20, so I'm breaking my own rule, but we can overlook that since this game will probably never age. Now, people consider the Game Boy Advance as pretty much a portable Super Nintendo. Even though it's a 32-bit system, a lot of their games still utilized similar graphic engines to the SNES. The Blazing Sword is a perfect example on how a game can be supported by simple graphics, yet looks so freaking amazing. In fact, the entire interface of this game is bound by simplicity, so the player can understand absolutely everything. Controls are therefore as intuitive as they can get, with zero lag or loading interference, so selecting any action whatsoever is neat as hell. Actually, when you go into battle and you change screens, it literally takes nothing, no time at all to load. Since the sprites look stunning already, their animations never get old. However, you can turn off these battle screens if you want to. I also believe this game contains mechanics that are still relevant in today's JRPGs, like a weapon breaking system that a lot of people complained about back then. Moreover, the story progression never gets boring, so the pacing is applauded here. The last thing for me to say is that the art style is marvelous. The character design by Sachiko Wada is among my favorite in JRPGs. Number 2. Suikoden 2. Not a lot of money was put into Suikoden 2, and it still managed to be a very impressive game. It sure did pale in comparison with the jaw-breaking graphics of some Squaresoft titles on the PS1. Yeah, those polygons in pre-rendered backgrounds that everyone criticizes nowadays. Obviously, Suikoden 2, with its simple yet gorgeous 2D sprites and its 4-directional buttons in exploration, aged way better than them. Glorious pixel art right here. I think the balance in this classic RPG is what compels it to stand playable today, because the encounter rate in most areas is either low or not too often. The loading time is pretty much only 1 or 2 seconds, as if the screen was already there hidden in the backgrounds. Besides, none of its battle mechanics dated poorly like other games of its time. Suikoden 1, for example, had some great ideas, but they evolved in Suikoden 2, which makes the ones in the first game kind of uninteresting in comparison, hence why I picked this one over the other for this video. There is still some improvement to be done with the tactical battles, but it's no big deal how it turned out to be. Everything still holds up pretty well. What matters here is how developers managed to produce such a marvelous game with so little resources. They thought way ahead of their time to make Suikoden 2 an ageless game that can be fully enjoyed today. Number 1. Valkyrie Profile. I confess that for a few years I feared Valkyrie Profile wouldn't age well, but graciously it did. The majority of the game is completely in 2D with environments that serve as both background and foreground. Landon running back and forth inside any area shines through, as her sprite was more colorful, precisely to make her stand out. The only part of the game that's in 3D is the overworld, with a really great sounding music theme. It gives you the impression from afar to be on top of a humble landscape, surrounded by a weeping sky. If it's depressing to look at, it's because it's supposed to be like that, which fits the plot perfectly. Landon's animation when flying around is still gorgeous to look at today. Valkyrie Profile has no random encounters. You can see the enemies in the areas and they can be avoided sometimes, so the pacing of this game has no real hindrance by unnecessary combat. Getting into battle has a few seconds of screen distortion, then we get a small loading time disguised as one of the most legendary battle animations of all time. Lenneth flapping her wings to bring out her warriors. Finally, the controls are intuitive in accordance to the menus and selection buttons. It's hard to believe that this was a PlayStation release. I know the same cannot be said about Lenneth's slippery controls during exploration, which might be the only feature that didn't really age that well, but anyway, this game looks so goddamn beautiful that it's literally a visual orgasm. Yeah, that sounded pretty bad. Anyway guys, those were my picks for today's video. What are yours? Let me know in the comment section below. Thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends. See you next time!